Good day, and welcome to another episode, a lesson on unlearning bad teachings. This week, we're going to take a look at a topic that is somewhat controversial in that it's one that is often discussed, and people have lots of questions around it. I'm going to take a pause on the discussion about the whiteness of Jesus and the removal of the Jewishness of Jesus to talk about this topic because it connects to the next topic about racism in the church. And this week's topic is the topic of hell. We don't, we all have different theories on where hell is and what hell is and things like that. But I'm just going to look at it strictly from specifically a biblical perspective and talk about how hell has been shaped throughout the generations into something very different than what the Bible says it is. So the way I'm going to start is if I had to ask you right now to point your head a certain way, and I asked you the question, where is heaven? Well, some people just went like this, right? And if I say, where is hell? Some people just went like this and looked down. We have this mentality that the heavens are above, earth is here, and hell is somewhere below us. This comes from a literal reading of Genesis. I often joke with people that if you want to make a flat earth discussion, read the beginning of Genesis. I don't believe in a flat earth. Let's just get that out of the way. But those that were writing in Genesis kind of did. And not quite a flat earth, but more of a giant snow globe, for lack of a better word, floating in space. And the idea was, if you kind of read it, out of the chaos, right? You have God starting to create in the first creation narrative. God creates from the chaos and takes the chaos and starts to form it into different ways. And in the first creation narrative, everything comes from the water. So the waters are stilled. And so you have these waters, and from the waters comes land. And then a dome is created over the waters. So underneath is this still idea of chaos. In the sky is a dome which holds back the chaos found in the sky. And in the middle sits the earth and the planet. This idea of a threefold heaven, earth, hell, or chaos is more like it, view of the world has stuck around for a very, very long time. But we've been through to space. We don't see any angels when we fly through the sky in an airplane. We've also know that in the middle of the earth is magma and the core and all of those different layers of the earth. There are no souls being tortured. There's no fires. There's no devil-like figure underneath them. So why does this view still persist amongst Christian communities, especially those that want to focus on the idea of hell and focus on the idea of torture, where God tortures people for eternity? Well, for some, the idea of retribution is very attractive, where bad people are punished for eternity, good people are rewarded with heaven, and the two never shall mix. This is very attractive to some people, especially those that have been harmed. I will share in the next video on racism in the church. One of the groups that went to hell were those who were people of color and Native Americans. But I don't want to get ahead too far. But there were different people that went to hell all the time. Those that were adulterers, those that were murderers, those that told gossip, those that talked about others, those that coveted. So all those that broke the commandments. The idea was, unless they repented, they were going to hell. Especially uh, the ones that went to hell were the people later on that didn't believe in Jesus. Now, think about that for a moment. Right now, on this earth, three quarters, if not more, of the world do not believe in Jesus. Does this mean that God is going to punish three quarters of the world for all eternity because they didn't believe in Jesus? I asked this in a Bible study one time, and there was a woman who was more evangelical. She came from a different church, and she gleefully said, yes, this is what God is going to do. God is going to punish all those that don't believe in Jesus, and is going to do it for eternity. And the good will go to heaven, and the evil will go to hell. And she was really happy about this. And I often say, as Christians, if this is your mentality that God is a punishing God who will punish for all eternity, why aren't we out there creating transformation? I read the Bible, and this version of a punishing God who punishes for eternity is not biblical. I know that's going to anger some of you, but it's just true. If you read the Bible, there isn't a mention of eternal torment. There is mention of weeping and gnashing of teeth and all of those things. And we'll get to that in just a second. But I will say that the vision of hell that we often have comes more from Dante's Divine Comedy than it does from the Bible. Well, some of you may not have ever read Dante, but in 1321, an Italian poet wrote what's called the Divine Comedy, and the word comedy doesn't mean the current meaning, which is a funny expression, but more comedy was an ordered view of the world. And so for Dante, one of the orders is this idea of 9 circles of hell. And in these 9 circles, there are various ways of people being tortured. For example, soothsayers, aka card readers, or whatever you want to say, have their heads on backwards so that they can't see where they're going. So throughout all their lives, they were going against God, and by telling the future, and those that went to them was all about the future. So God punishes them by turning their head backwards so they can't see where they're going. Gluttons are overfed, for example, and things like that. So all of this is mentioned in Dante's Inferno, which is one section of the Divine Comedy. And the whole book was written as a commentary on the Italian rich, rather than a idea of a religious take, but it had more influence than people would like to admit. In fact, later theologians read his Divine Comedy and used it to shape some of their theologies. But you may be asking, hey, wait, I know that the word hell is in the Bible. So what are you talking about, Pastor? Well, yes and no. The King James Version, if you read that, took a lot of liberties and translated some words that didn't mean hell and made them into hell. And so if you read the King James Version and some translations that come from the King James Version, the word hell appears all the time in the Bible. So you're saying, Pastor, you are full of it. You don't know what you're talking about. Hell is there, it is there everywhere. But if you read other translations that stick more to the Hebrew and the Greek, which I'm drawing a lot of what I'm teaching about from the Hebrew and from the Greek rather than from translations, you see kind of 3 words. There's actually a 4th, which I'll get into in just a moment, but 3 words that are often translated into hell that aren't actually hell. The first comes in the Old Testament, and that is Sheol. Sheol is the most often used in the Old Testament. It's often the place of the dead. In fact, when we talk about the Apostles' Creed, which has been later translated and changed into Jesus descended into hell. It's actually the better translation is Jesus descended into the dead, going to the place of Sheol. And so in the Old Testament, again, the King James Version translates Sheol into hell, but it's actually Sheol, which is just a waiting place. Whether you were good, bad, mediocre, everybody went into the waiting place, the place of the dead, and was waiting for the Messiah to break them free so that there could be judgment after that. In fact, Jesus references this often. Paul references this often as well. This idea of people waiting after they've died for the Messiah to come to free them from this waiting place where judgment now occurs. The place that is named is Sheol, and that is the messianic figure that's going to come and free them. The second place that Paul often mentions, which gets translated into hell, is Hades. Now, some of you may recognize that, especially if you're a game player. There's a game called Hades where you see the different levels of the Greek idea of the place of the dead. Well, this is exactly what Paul is talking about. Hades was the Greek version of the place of the dead, and there were different locations in Hades. For example, Tartarus was one of the places. Now, you may recognize this word because it appears in 2 Peter 2:4. Again, in 2 Peter 2:4, if you have the King James Version, it's translated into hell, but the actual word in Greek there is Tartarus, which is this kind of general waiting place where everybody went before they went on to their next place. In 2 Peter 2:4, it's where God casts the angels that defied God and sends them into Tartarus, as the actual translation goes. But in the Greek world, this is where Zeus threw the Titans and his father Cronus after their defeat. So you see a parallel there. But Paul uses Hades because he's often speaking to those that spoke Greek as a way of discussing a place that's the place of the dead, similar to Sheol. Everybody went to Hades. Whether you were good, bad, indifferent, you went to Hades. Some went to Asphodel, which is the general waiting place for everybody. It was a field that almost everybody went to, but some went to the Elysian fields. That's where the champions went. Those that were important, they went there, and it was a place of comfort and a place of blessing, so to speak. But everybody went to Hades. Good, bad, indifferent, everybody went to Hades. And Paul is speaking to that when he's trying to relate the version of Sheol to Greek-speaking people, and he's using that analogy between the two of them. So within there, though, as I said, there's that kind of fourth one, which is the Tartarus, which is found in 2 Peter. So that's the hidden fourth version that's often translated into hell. But the biggest one that's found in the New Testament is Gehenna. Those that have ever traveled to Jerusalem, you know that Gehenna is a real place. Some people, the location is not quite known, but it's somewhere south of Jerusalem. But you can go visit it right now. But in Matthew, for example, the translation is, "It is better for you to enter life with one eye than two and be thrown into Gehenna." Again, it's often in Bibles translated into hell, but the word there is Gehenna. It's a place where both body and soul are destroyed. There's no eternal torment there. There is no idea of torture. It's if you really want to get into it, it's the idea is if you are ultimately rejecting of God, everything about you gets destroyed. But we'll get into that in just a second. Gehenna, though, was a real place, but it was also a cursed place. So Jesus is a rabbi. Uh, and again, going back to why do we erase the Jewishness of Jesus? Nobody seems to know, but as a rabbi, he would have known Jeremiah very well. And so, speaking to Jewish people who he's ministering to, using the word Gehenna would have triggered for people who were listening this idea of a cursed place. In Jeremiah, it was supposedly the place where children were sacrificed by worshipers of Baal. And so, this place of child sacrifice, and it specifically says where sons and daughters are thrown and burned by fire. Later on in Jeremiah, Jeremiah curses it as a cursed place. And so when you read that, as I said, it was a place where bodies were burned. And so if mothers were there and saw their children being burned, there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So when Matthew uses the word Gehenna, Jesus does in the Gospel of Matthew, he's referring to this place in Jeremiah where this is a cursed place, but everything is destroyed. Not eternal torture, none of that. The only place that we get this idea of a eternal place of is in the parable, right, of the rich man and Lazarus. That's the only place where we kind of see an image of a man having being unquenched with fire, or I should say, unquenchable thirst, with the Lazarus staying above him, but they can see each other as you get there. It's also a parable. And so the parable isn't to describe heaven and hell. The parable is to describe about ignoring the poor and our need to focus on the poor. And so to use a parable as a descriptor of this is Jesus describing heaven and hell would be incorrect. So what about this place of eternal torture? As I said, it's not there in the Bible. But fire is. And the idea of fire is often associated with God or a refiner's fire in particular, not torture. Think about the Exodus narrative, right? God leads them by fire, the burning bush, all of these things. And then later on, we get the refiner's fire, the one that transforms and gives new life to something that was lost and forgotten. So while retribution often sounds good to somebody looking for who has been harmed, it's not the way of God, though. We don't often see God torturing or doing anything to people. In fact, God wants to bring us closer, and this is what Jesus often teaches, that God wants us close. And so the fires images are refining fires, not torturing fires. They're images of God's transformation of those that were harmed into a new life and a new place. As I said, though, there's just like one or two images that says if you ultimately reject God and God's love and everything, it's not an eternal torture, but a complete elimination. And that's only found in Revelation and later on. And so Revelation, though, is a giant poem about transforming the world and what does it mean as Christians to transform that world. It wasn't meant to be an image of this is what exactly is going to happen to the world at the end, but it's a way of how God will transform the world ultimately and has transformed the world ultimately through the cross. That the transformation has already happened in Revelation and not something that's going to come later on. It's under apocalyptic literature. But that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother time. But I often am cautious when talking about hell because there's very different translations and very different words when it's there. But it also doesn't describe a God I know. And I don't understand how people could be gleeful or want this vision of God who would torture somebody for all of eternity for a single life choice in the world. It goes against what Paul would say, which is about works. We don't believe in works to gain us entry into heaven, but through the power of Jesus Christ. But yet, this vision of hell goes back to the idea of works righteousness. That somehow, if we do something wrong, we go to hell all the time. But again, this comes more from Dante and some authors like Augustine rather than the Bible. The Bible has a very different narrative where it's about not retribution, but restoration, where those that have done harm are restored to a place where forgiveness can flow and grace can happen. They don't hold on to their sins. They don't hold on to their evil ways. There is no more crying, to quote Revelation. There is no more sickness. There is no more death. There is no more of these things. There is restoration now and love found in God. But for some, this vision of God is attractive, where God is a torturous God. And I don't know where that comes from or why somebody would want to hold on to this image. For me, the God of love is the God that I read about in the Bible. The God of restoration is the one that I read about in the Bible. The God of grace is the one that Paul writes about in his works. The God who loves is the one that Jesus proclaims. So why do we hold on to these images? I hope you enjoyed this week's lesson. I hope there were some thoughtful aspects to it. I know some of you may disagree, and that's okay too, but we'll talk about more of how this image of hell was also used to promote whiteness. I hope that tantalizes you just a little bit. So I will say that next week there will be a lesson, and then the following 2 weeks later, for 2 weeks I should say, there will not be any lessons uploaded. We'll resume the second week of April. I hope you have a wonderful day today. Take care.